welcome to TR4 Let's Talk. I'm your host, Swapnil Bhartiya, and my next guest is once again Julian Fischer, CEO of anynines. Julian, it's great to have you back on the show.
Hi, great to see you again.
Cloud Foundry Summit is around the corner, and today we are going to talk about your talk, double words there, which is more or less about when to use Cloud Foundry and when to use Kubernetes vis-a-vis. So before we get started, can you give us a kind of overview or insight into what kind of migration are you seeing from Cloud Foundry to Kubernetes?
Kubernetes is a long story, and also from the Cloud Foundry community, we've been monitoring Kubernetes for a while. In the last month, or let's say in the last 1 or 2 years, the Kubernetes ecosystem has accelerated quite a lot, and people were wondering whether it is time to move to a Kubernetes-based platform, maybe even moving or migrating Cloud Foundry workloads to Kubernetes. We have many clients from different industries, and among that, many clients with Cloud Foundries. So we've been asked what is the right timing to migrate, and sometimes customers just made their own decisions without consulting us and started enthusiastically internal projects in the attempt to move to Kubernetes. So the experience here was surprising because of the popularity of Kubernetes. One may think, well, it's a technology that's been used for years. The ecosystem is thriving. There are many interesting products available. There are commercial vendors and countless of them. So one may think such a migration would go just, easy as pie. But it turned out to be not the case. So what we've observed is that some of these projects that have been started enthusiastically have been even abandoned. Now, this doesn't say anything bad about Kubernetes. It's a fantastic piece of technology, but it says something about Cloud Foundry and its maturity. Especially those environments where Cloud Foundry environments got very large. So we're talking about thousands of virtual machines, for example. In these environments, organizations put hundreds, thousands of applications, sometimes even thousands of organizations. That means that's the notion of a tenant in a Cloud Foundry environment. So they have a lot of applications that are 12-factor compliant. And these apps are run, and they run on a Cloud Foundry. Developers are happy with the user experience, and often a single operations team is enough to operate several of these environments. So the unique thing about Cloud Foundry is not only the user experience, the CF push experience, which is quite nice, along with build packs, providing organizations the ability to have central governance, for example, how code is turned into a runnable or running container. But more than that, the lifecycle management that comes with BOSH, the primary way to run Cloud Foundry, has shown to be an exceptional technology. And even if people wish to just replace it with Kubernetes, and Cloud Foundry environments with that scale, it turned out to be hard.
You mentioned that a lot of clients, they started the migration and then they stopped. And then as you said, that's nothing to do with Kubernetes, but it was more to do with Cloud Foundry. So can you give some reasons if you came across that, why they abandoned those migrations when they invested a lot in those migrations? What happened?
It depends on the workload you want to run. So if I, for example, were to approach a software project, and the software project, for example, includes workloads that currently run on a virtual machine. I'm not talking about a BOSH managed virtual machine, but really a plain virtual machine. It's a piece of software. Maybe it's being active developed. And I have many of these virtual machines. That's something I would rather put on a Kubernetes cluster. And these pods, they have their own IP addresses, so whatever port assignment is there, I can basically move that to Kubernetes. So that's a workload I'll put on Kubernetes. If you have a few stateless apps, shouldn't be a problem either. However, if you have an organization with, let's say, 5,000 tenants and many applications, Cloud Foundry provides you the ability to run these workloads in a single Cloud Foundry environment. Now, if you take such an environment and you want to migrate it into Kubernetes, the question would be, is a single Kubernetes cluster able to run these workloads? And this also leads to the question where you in Cloud Foundry have user management and tenant isolation through the concept of organizations. Is, for example, the abilities of Kubernetes to authenticate or the namespaces concept strong enough to map organizations one-to-one to Kubernetes namespaces? And it turned out that this is not the case. I mean, to many Kubernetes insiders, this isn't surprising. They'd say, well, you'd have to add your own identity server and you'd have to use multiple Kubernetes clusters instead. And that's absolutely true. So the question rises, what is the mapping between the number of Kubernetes the number of Cloud Foundry organizations to the number of Kubernetes clusters? So let's assume it's 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. So you have many more Kubernetes clusters than you'd have Cloud Foundry environments. If they are all alike, you can automate the lifecycle management. Still, it's additional work because it's just many more clusters and you have to touch more things when operating such a system. Now, to be fair, wherever Kubernetes is operated or offered to clients, they tend to use what Kubernetes is about. And this includes, for example, the installation of custom extensions, such as service meshes and so on. So over time, it shows that these clusters, they are not only home for 12-factor applications, but they also they serve other workloads, sometimes even data services. So these clusters develop a certain complexity. So in these accounts where we looked and talked to clients, it showed that the economy of scale of a large Cloud Foundry environment is better than a number of Kubernetes clusters imitating a similar behavior compared to Cloud Foundry. And I think that's when some of the clients were asking themselves, well, there's certainly a large room where Kubernetes will be dominant, but is it necessary to touch that Cloud Foundry environment right now, or are there other business priorities? And I think in many of the cases, customers abandoned their migration projects because there was no economy in performing the migration right away.
Can you also talk about a bit about the interoperability challenges or compatibility between the Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry environment, which may be at times the reason for some friction or a smooth ride for users?
Usually you equip this Cloud Foundry with service brokers that do data service automation for you. So in the case of the anynines data service, for example, you have an underlying BOSH that will provision on-demand instances of various data services such as Postgres and RabbitMQ and so on. So what I'm saying is that the data service automation seamlessly integrates with the Cloud Foundry environment, and the organization concept again is served to isolate the tenants. So the Cloud Foundry also provides the concept of application security group, so the means to isolate applications on the network layer from applications of other tenants. Now, this is basically what you get when using a Cloud Foundry. If you have multiple Kubernetes clusters, where each Kubernetes cluster has its own network, and you would like to have interoperability between those clusters, cluster federation is still something, let's say, being developed at the moment. There are ways to do that. There are service mesh concepts on how to integrate different Kubernetes clusters. There's always the way to use ingresses to have, let's say, an exchange between different Kubernetes clusters, but it introduces complexity that's not there if you have a Cloud Foundry environment. So just one example, if the question, for example, is if you have hundreds of organizations in a Cloud Foundry and you turn that into hundreds of Kubernetes clusters, where do you put the data service automation? Are you going to install an operator in 100 environments? That also creates overhead. And this is what I mean with economy of scale. If you centralize operators in one particular Kubernetes cluster, that Kubernetes cluster becomes at some point maybe even too big, or you have to solve the intercluster communication problem. So it's nothing that can't be done. And I'm pretty sure that the Kubernetes ecosystem, if not already there are solutions will be upcoming. But it's not that you just take, a platform product off the shelf and put it into your environment and it will just work its charm. If you're a small organization and a single Kubernetes cluster or a few of them is good for you, Kubernetes provides you a pleasant user experience and you can get them with low effort on any major platform or infrastructure. But if you are a large corporate and you don't have a solid strategy on how to federate and nurture these Kubernetes clusters, which become numerous in your organization in a particular systematic way, that'll create a lot of organizational friction. And it also presented some of our clients with setbacks in their business strategies because they were surprised how many problems arose in that ecosystem from this new technology. And I'm not a Kubernetes skeptic or anyway. It's just saying that the particular let's say our customers using Cloud Foundry, they represent they have a certain load profile. That's why, because they still have Cloud Foundry, because it has that economy of scale. And if you look at Kubernetes, you can potentially imitate a Cloud Foundry environment, but not with the same economy of scale. It's not just it is not a drop-in replacement. That's basically the takeaway.
You alluded to that a bit, but if you can give some case or examples where it's like, as much as you like it to become a Swiss Army knife, that's not the case. There are cases where Cloud Foundry that's where the ideal solution is. And at the same time, there are a lot of cases, many more cases where Kubernetes is the ideal solution. But we are talking about from your customer's perspective, where you saw that, hey, it was less about solving a problem. It was more about excitement about the technology. They tried it, and that did not work in that use case.
It's not that these customers don't adapt Kubernetes. It's just that the idea of eradicating Cloud Foundry environments in favor of Kubernetes didn't work out according to their expectations. So that's basically the main point. And we as a company, as anynines, we also invest heavily in Kubernetes. So let's take, for example, both application operation and data service automation as two topics that currently are solved in a Cloud Foundry platform. Cloud Foundry obviously being the home for apps, and our anynines data service the home for data. In Kubernetes environments, there are very interesting other workload profiles that fit Kubernetes much better. For example, if you have the idea of a cluster as the home for a distributed system, let's say a particular piece of software, including databases and applications that will be composed of microservices, and you want to run such a system like many times, it is very important that each cluster has little overhead, but still provides you with uniform APIs to run them at scale. For example, like 1,000 clusters that look alike. That's what we call cluster templating. And it will also be one of the features in the upcoming Kubernetes modules of the anynines platform. And this is, for example, where Kubernetes is excellent. It has very little overhead. And you can have multiple Kubernetes clusters. And you should have multiple Kubernetes clusters if the flexibility Kubernetes provides you is what you want. And if your team is capable of dealing with the additional responsibilities that get along with it. And that's the whole point of these discussions about what's better. It's the question of what is your workload and what are the skills of your organization, and then what's the right tool to get the job done. And there are niches where Cloud Foundry is still ahead the Kubernetes, and there are other areas where Kubernetes has cannibalized application hosting or container orchestration, and that's good. It's fair. It's evolution of software, and we all embrace it. It would be naive to defend Cloud Foundry or anything beyond the arrival of a technology that conquers a certain niche in better ways, and that would be inefficient and lead to error-prone choices. I think both technologies have their place, and they will go their way.
The focus of the topic is more or less like, when CF makes sense versus when Kubernetes makes sense. We have had this discussion earlier also that it's actually not about versus. It's not Kubernetes versus Cloud Foundry Plus. Both Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry, they are part of the same organization, Linux Foundation, CNCF versus Cloud Foundry. And they are like complementing each other. So how do you see that aspect, which we have talked about earlier? Or do you see that, hey, we have reached the phase that it has kind of become Kubernetes versus Cloud Foundry? Or no, it is the same. The point that you're trying to drive here is not Kubernetes versus Cloud Foundry. It's whatever makes sense in that particular use case. And as you also said, there are many customers who use both. But it's not dismantling the whole Cloud Foundry environment and replace with Kubernetes. That's what seemed that was happening, but that is not the case.
Well, to some degree, where two technologies overlap in potential use cases, there's always a technology A versus a technology B. So for example, you could argue Kubernetes runs on OpenStack. Well, there is no OpenStack versus Kubernetes. But I think this would somehow deny the ability of Kubernetes to run certain workloads that used to run as virtual machines on an OpenStack. So there is some degree of cannibalization between Kubernetes and OpenStack, and there is some degree of cannibalization of Kubernetes towards Cloud Foundry. But at the same time, the path that Cloud Foundry will go is to adapt Kubernetes more in the future. So I think it's unavoidable that if you run large swath of applications, you will have multiple Kubernetes clusters. So the proposals in current drafts or in Cloud Foundry development would be to have, for example, a centralized Cloud Foundry control plane, which is then helping to organize workloads across several Kubernetes clusters. This will assume that each Kubernetes cluster is lifecycle managed in an automated fashion and runs, let's say, in an autopilot mode or anything alike. And once this has happened, Cloud Foundry will transition and become, more Kubernetes-centered. I think the legacy of Cloud Foundry, which is the idea of CF push, or the legacy that came originally from Heroku. If you look at Heroku has seen a decline in popularity because the container movement has gained popularity, and that to some degree affected Cloud Foundry as well. So this is also something that will be observed. It is the fact that the Cloud Foundry community has been decreasing in size due to the emergence of Kubernetes. But I also think that's natural to some degree. And I think that organizations that have invested into Cloud Foundry a lot, they will have many years to come and where they benefit from Cloud Foundry, whether this is on Kubernetes or based on BOSH. It was just interesting to see that. I thought personally, and I have to admit that, it would be faster that Kubernetes becomes the primary way to run Cloud Foundry, but it surprisingly showed how much value there is in Bosch as an underlying technology, which is, I said that for years, it's one of the most underrated technologies of our times. So Kubernetes is going to be a very interesting direction also for Cloud Foundry, and they will meld together at some point. So let's see how the dynamics will evolve. I mean, on the level of the Cloud Foundry Foundation, for example, anynines has the plan to commit to help maintaining Cloud Foundry, so that Cloud Foundry will have vendors taking care of long-term support for Cloud Foundry environments that are there, help to operate them, help to equip them with data service automation, and also help customers to migrate to Kubernetes-based Cloud Foundries or even to other Kubernetes platforms if they want to. Because, I mean, the mission is to get the job done. It's not about the technology in every detail.
Julian, thank you so much for taking out time from your schedule and talk about your upcoming talk at the Cloud Foundry Summit. I wish we could have done it in person like we have been doing it for years, but we'll do with whatever cards we're dealt with. So thanks for your time today.
Well, thank you as well, and hopefully see you soon on the next conference in person. So we'll keep that hope up.